biggest bombshells in John Bolton's new book is his allegation that President Trump sought help in his reelection effort from the Chinese president. Will this impact U.S.-China relations moving forward? For analysis, we're calling on Asia expert Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. He joins us from New Jersey. All right, Gordon, what do you make of Bolton's charge that Trump was trying to get the Chinese government to help him be reelected?
Well, that certainly is a bombshell revelation. Ambassador Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative who was in the room at the time, says that Bolton's charge is absolutely untrue. Also, we've got language from Vanity Fair, which supposedly has President Trump's exact words. Bolton said that Trump was pleading with Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler. The Vanity Fair language shows that Trump was trying to intimidate Xi Jinping. I actually don't know what's going on at this point, but clearly the charges are going back and forth. And, this is not going to end because clearly, as you say, if true, this would actually be a problem for President Trump going forward.
Bolton also claims that Trump told Xi he believed China's mass incarceration of Muslim minorities was the right thing to do. How could he possibly have said that?
Yeah, that really is a shocker as well. And that revelation, by the way, was the same day as President Trump signed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. Um, I don't know exactly, of course, what Trump said to Xi Jinping, but I doubt that the words that Bolton were using were the ones that Trump actually said, because that doesn't sound like the president. I know the president doesn't put human rights at the top of his list, but to actually approve what the Chinese leader was doing, I think probably is much further than Trump would have gone.
Now, one of the concepts of the Trump campaign is that Joe Biden is weak on China. What to you does that mean?
Well, I think what the Trump campaign is saying is that Trump would be a much better defender of American interests than Biden. There are a number of statements from Biden, especially from May 1st of last year, which are troubling. Both candidates, though, Trump and Biden, have vulnerabilities on China. The one difference, Larry, is that as president, he can actually change voters' perceptions of his China policies. So it gives an advantage to Trump, and that means that Trump probably is going to be a bit tougher on China than he otherwise would have been during the campaign.
Tell me about what's going on now between China and India.
There is a border dispute high in the Himalayas in Ladakh. On June 15th, there was a clash. At least 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Perhaps as many as 35 Chinese soldiers were killed. 10 Indians were taken prisoner who have now been returned. This appears, the U.S. intelligence community says, was a deliberate provocation by China. But in any event, whatever occurred that night, it has triggered mass protests against China in India. And it's going to have consequences for Beijing because people in India just were outraged by the killing of Indian soldiers.
You think China's more worried about Trump or Biden?
I think they're worried about both of them, but in different ways. One thing that Trump has done is he's not really worked with allies in trying to build a coalition against China. That's something Biden would be much better at. But I think that the Chinese look at Trump's policies as being much more resolute than what President Biden would be implementing. So there are pluses and minuses for Beijing. I think Beijing, though, ultimately believes that whoever is elected, the next president is going to be tougher on China than otherwise, largely because it's not the question of whether it's Trump or Biden. It's a question of Beijing pushing the U.S. in directions we don't want to go. So this is a China question, not a President Biden or a President Trump question.
What is Beijing's reaction to Hong Kong?
Well, Beijing right now is in the process of implementing national security legislation. It's going through the National People's Congress in Beijing, probably will be finalized before July 1st, which is the anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China. Basically, Beijing bypassed the Hong Kong Legislative Council in putting this unpopular legislation in place. And this really means a full takeover of Hong Kong, because the provisions that have been released are really draconian and indicate that Beijing is not going to put up with any dissent in the territory.
Is it okay to travel to Hong Kong, say for Americans?
For the meantime, it is. But we got to remember that even in calm times, China will take hostages. So, for instance, there are two Canadians who have now been held for more than a year and a half, only because Canada detained Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei Technologies chief financial officer, at the request of the U.S., and she's subject to an extradition proceeding. And so what China did was it reached out and just grabbed two Canadians and held them incommunicado almost. So China is always going to be dangerous for foreigners, and especially more so as we move into more tense times. Hong Kong is not going to be very much safer for them than China.
Do you think we'll ever be second to China in the world?
I don't think so, Larry. Right now, what China is doing with its wolf warrior diplomacy is aggravating everybody. We talked about in India, the United States, even Europe is becoming a bit tougher on China. The problem for China, though, is also its economy. It contracted in the first quarter of this year. In reality, I think it's going to continue to contract this quarter. That makes China vulnerable. They've also got a second wave of coronavirus now in Beijing, which further weakens them. So China appears a lot less fearsome than it once did, and I think that's going to have repercussions. The U.S. is inherently a strong society. We'll weather this, and we will be where we are going forward.
Gordon Chang, as always, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Larry.